Sweet. Thank you, Debbie. You are also awesome, for the record. Let's see here. All right, what's up, everybody? I'm gonna share my screen.
Hey, how's it going?
Pretty good.
I
Okay.
missed the first couple of these, so look forward to kind of learning and jumping in here. But thanks for doing this. Appreciate it.
Yeah, for sure. Welcome. So I kind of want to, first of all, today I actually kind of wanted to start off to see if any of you guys have any questions. Like, have you guys had a chance to like play around in either this repository that I made, or like even just the built-in playground in the TypeScript documentation, or just on your own? Like, have you guys had a chance to do that?
I played around a little bit last week.
Okay.
But not very extensively.
Mm-hmm. Cool.
Me too, except generics. I haven't practiced generics.
Okay. Yeah, do you guys have any like pressing questions, anything like that from last week or even the week before? Anything TypeScript related?
I think I was still trying to wrap my head around all those utilities you built and kind of using those custom types.
Custom types, okay.
So I think, yeah, that's kind of where brain power ended at that point.
Okay, cool. Well, let's that's actually kind of where I wanted to start today. So let's see here. So I've been playing around in this environment. I had some fun this week solving the brackets challenge. I don't know if you guys saw that in the dev students channel or something. The challenge was to like create a function that can parse string brackets to see that whether they're valid or not.
Yeah, I remember that one.
Yeah, so
I saw that one like a month ago, but using queues.
Yeah, that's how you do it with a queue. Or at least that's how I solved it. Anyways, that was fun. So I did that in TypeScript. So if we get a chance, I might kind of go over some things there, although it uses some slightly advanced stuff, but I think you guys can handle it. So let's start over here. Let me save this branch actually. Okay.
Do you think what vSchool will in the future start to think about teaching TypeScript as part of that later aspect of the curriculum?
That would be
kind of a self-taught thing.
That'd be really cool. The only problem is that it's just a lot of information to do TypeScript and JavaScript in a boot camp. So like, maybe they could, maybe they might decide to do like an extra like TypeScript focused course, like separate or something. Cause like, or maybe they could integrate it from like the very beginning. I'm not sure. I don't foresee them doing that like anytime soon, but it would be cool. I mean, given the fact that TypeScript is becoming so important. But it also, since the bootcamp is already so short, it'd be hard to cram that in there. But with the fact that it's kind of more, the model, they've changed their model so that it's more of a responsive learning, like it would actually probably be pretty, I don't think it would be that difficult to add it in. It's just like kind of like its own independent module in a way.
Or they can add it like optional.
Right, yeah. And so like, In fact, maybe I'll talk to them about, creating a TypeScript module or something that could just be available. That could be, that actually might be cool.
Yeah, I mean, they're always iterating on their curriculum. So as things become more and more important or mainstream, they typically do change. So, and since we've got, Ben here already teaching this kind of stuff, might as well utilize him, right?
Yeah, like I would love to make a TypeScript course. So maybe I'll talk to Mo. That'd be fun.
Ben, I got a question for you.
Go ahead.
And again, sorry I couldn't make the first couple meetings,
That's all
but definitely interested in TypeScript. Do you have any resources that are kind of like beginner level on TypeScript so I can kind of,
Absolutely.
myself to it?
Yep. Can you see my screen?
Yep.
Okay. So the first place I would go is typescriptlang.org. These are the official docs. Go to the doc section and then read through this section first. You can probably skip Java, C#, because it's, I don't know, you probably, unless you have C# experience, I'm not sure this would really be that relevant. But they just talk about, basically this is for people, this article is geared towards people who are maybe coming from like more of an object-oriented language like Java or C#. There's some helpful stuff in there too, but I would prioritize this one, and then these guys.
Perfect. Awesome. Thanks for that.
Yep.
I'll look at this.
Yep. And then once you kind of are able to set up something there, I would just kind of read through these. This isn't like a tutorial though, so to speak. It's these are just like some general concepts. I think they have like a few examples in each one. So for example, like the basic types, like they'll kind of like, this is kind of the handbook. So this is how I learned TypeScript. Honestly, I didn't watch any videos or anything. I just used the documentation and it was just purely trial and error.
Perfect.
Yeah, so that's what I recommend. Oh, sorry, I gotta let some people into the room. There we go. All right. So, okay, so now we know that, so TypeScript, to go back to the basics, TypeScript is just a superset of JavaScript, which just means that any JavaScript syntax is also by definition valid TypeScript syntax. TypeScript just also provides some additional syntax for type checking, and type checking simply means that you are enforcing rules on the types of values that things can have that are checked at compile time, which means that before you actually run the code, TypeScript actually does a pass through everything to ensure that the rules that you've determined in your configuration here are being followed. That's kind of the lowdown in a nutshell. So, and as we know, whenever you're defining values or variables, you need to type them, which means that you define what category certain values are supposed to take. And types can be very basic, such as Boolean or number or string, etc. They can be array. They can be interfaces, which are determine the shapes of objects. And they can also be enums, which are, sorry, there's someone says something in the chat. Oh, cool. Thanks, Debbie. All right, so we can have interfaces, we can have enums, which are basically enumerables, meaning that a value can be one of a set. So an enum defines a set of values that a particular value may have. And then of course there are function values, which have parameters, which you can type, and then they have return values, which you can type. So if you're ever writing a function, you want to define what types of values the parameters can be and what type of value it returns. There are also, in addition to just some of the basic types, there are what are called type aliases. Type aliases are basically a way of kind of creating your own custom types where you can define a name, such as I want an ID, for example, to be a string. So now my ID is an alias for this type. Now this would be a trivial example. I don't think you'd ever see that. But we might have something like string or number. Now we've got a interesting type, which is something that can either be a string or a number. So if I'm saying that something is an ID, I'm saying that it's one of those two types. And we can create lots and lots and lots of different types from the ground up, which is pretty cool. So that's kind of what I wanted to focus on today. So does anyone have any questions so far?
Nope.
Okay.
Sounds good.
Cool. Okay, so now I'm going to reference the documentation here because they've got a lot of good examples. Where it's in the here we go, utility types. Okay, so in this section, there is a section called utility types, and we're gonna look a little bit more about how these work. The ones that basically come built in with TypeScript, they were determined to be just so useful and so universally helpful that they actually just packaged these types with TypeScript, so you can use them out of the box. There's partial, there's read only, which we won't talk about today. Record we're going to talk about today. Pick is really cool. Omit, exclude, extract. The only other one I wanted to talk about. Okay, return type is cool. And then there's one. I think was there one other one? Nope, that's really the only ones are partial, record, pick, omit, and exclude. That's probably all we'll worry about today. So what these do, they call them utility types because they just come with TypeScript. But there's nothing special about them really. They're just using the rules of TypeScript. They're exploiting this concept of a type alias. This right now is a type alias where you use the type keyword to define the type of something under some name. It's basically a variable. However, it's a little more abstract than a variable because this is a type that a real JavaScript variable may or may not have, or may or may not belong to. So let's think of some examples. So let's say that I am creating some sort of configuration object, okay? And a configuration object is usually just an object that just has some properties that you can kind of flag as like true or false, or maybe like uses like a string to denote a value or something. For example, here's this tsconfig. This is a classic example of a configuration file, which just kind of has some metadata about how some program should behave. For example, this configuration file saying, hey, include all the files located in this folder. And don't include any of those things. This property right here says, hey, that's the name of the folder I want you to create when you compile all this. So on and so forth. So let's pretend I'm making some arbitrary configuration. So I'll call it config for now. Okay, now our configuration. Now, usually what happens when you have a configuration file, you have a base config, which just means that you've got your defaults. Okay, so normally, like if I have some function do something and it takes some configuration and it goes and do something based on the config. Oops. Based on this value, then usually this thing has like a bunch of default values that if you want to, you can override them. Does that make sense? Like if you, is that concept something you guys have like encountered enough?
Right, so it doesn't break if you don't get what you need.
Sure, exactly. Like if I were to call this do something, I cannot spell that right. Okay, so for example, this function right here, I should be able to call it just empty, and it should then just automatically contain the default values. And if I've decided to override some value, then I could put in something, and it should then also respect that as well. This is kind of like good API design. It's good function design is to assume defaults and then let them be overridden so that you don't inadvertently break things. You don't want to rely on the user too much. So, okay, we're going to just pretend that we have some configurations here. Okay, so I don't know, let's come up with some names for these. So let's say this configuration says, you know, we have to give it a name, whatever this program is, whatever it does. And let's say, let's just start with that. Okay, so our config is just a config. Okay, and we're not even going to worry about the logic here because I don't care what this does. We just care that, okay, this provides some sort of interface or some sort of thing that we can do stuff with. Now, the thing is if I try to call this function with nothing in it, well, I've got a problem because it's expecting me to put something in there, which means I have to put in a name. Okay, that's fine. However, let's initiate this default configuration concept. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to define a default config, and it's going to be called, and it's going to be a config. So that means that now our name is our default name. Okay. Now I'm going to add some more properties here. So let's say there's some value that we care about, and maybe this is a string or a number. Okay, and we'll go here and we'll say, okay, value is the default value. All right, cool. And then let's say there are some things that are, let's say that we need, there's potentially some items in here that we care about. They're it's an array of numbers. Oh, whoops, I put that in the wrong spot. This goes up here. Okay. Okay. So here's this totally arbitrary configuration thing. Okay, so notice that there's a lot of properties that this has. And let's say this function that I'm doing really only has, like, I want to be able to do the following. I want to be able to either provide nothing, or I want to provide one or more of those properties, but I don't want it to yell at me just because I didn't pass one in. Because, for example, in this case, I want the rest to be filled out by the defaults. I don't want to have to like manually say, okay, give me the default config and then override it like that. You know, that puts too much, that's too much effort for the user to worry about. You know, I only want to have to put in the values that I care about, and I want the function to set the defaults itself. So that means that this thing right here is actually a different type than what this actual configuration object is here. They're related, but essentially what we're saying is this should be some subset of this, meaning it's everything that the default is, just I want all the properties to be optional. Does that make sense?
I think so.
Cool. So I want to be able to do. Say what?
No, I'm just saying I haven't actually seen it before, but it's making sense the way you're explaining it.
Cool. Yeah, awesome. So yeah, all we're saying is I want to be able to pass in some object that has all these properties, but they're optional. So I can either provide nothing or some subset, or even the whole thing. Like if I really need to configure the whole thing, then I can do that too. But it shouldn't, I don't want my compiler to yell at me and to force me to have to put all those values in myself. So that means that we're going to actually have to, we can use type aliases to kind of derive new types from other types. So what I'm going to do here is I'm actually going to change this up a little bit. I'm going to call this the default config. Okay. And what I'm then going to do is I'm going to, oh wait, oops, sorry. This is, goes up here. Okay. So default config is this. We're defining that as the default config. Okay, cool. And then we're going to say that, okay, this config, if you don't exist, we're going to initialize with the default config. Okay, so if you haven't seen this syntax before in ES6, this has nothing to do with Typescript. This is just saying if you don't pass in something, oops, if you don't pass in something, then just set it to that. So if you if that's undefined, then just set it to that. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay. So this is what we're doing. We're just saying, hey, config, you are this type. And if you aren't provided, then we're just going to set it. Okay, cool. So now my compiler is working fine. Don't worry about this little yellow line. Just because I haven't used the variable. There we go. Gets rid of that. Okay. So now, okay, so that sort of gets us to where we're going. The problem is that once I do put something in here, now I'm going to start seeing errors. I'm going to start saying, hey, look, you don't have any of those properties you said you wanted. So we still have our problem. Our problem is that we still need to make some of these properties optional. So type aliases let us do that. So just like earlier, I did a very trivial example saying that type ID equals string or number. We can do some pretty cool stuff. What I'm going to do is I'm going to say, hey, create a type that takes every property in this object and makes them optional. We can actually loop through essentially a type and do stuff. And it looks kind of like this. So what we're going to do is we're going to say type config. I'm going to rename this config. And what this is going to be is a object that has properties of default config. This will look a little weird, but we're going to use the bracket syntax to show that, hey, we're defining a property, a dynamic property on this type. And it's going to be, we can name it whatever. I'm going to call it K in default config. This means property of default config. Oh, sorry, K in key of. Yeah. Okay. This looks a little weird, I know, but what we're saying is define a variable, a property called K, which is in the set of the keys, the properties, in other words, of this object. And then the value is the corresponding key value pair. So this is going to be K. This, what we've done so far here is we've essentially made a copy of this type, but we can expand it if we wanted to, which in fact, I don't want to get ahead of myself. I'll do that in a second. So here what we're saying is, okay, take all the properties in all the property names, all the keys in this object, the default config object, and we're going to splay them out in this config type, and they're going to have just their corresponding value. But the key here is to say, hey, whatever key that may be, make it optional. And that's what this question mark is. If I wanted one of these to be optional by default, I could just put a question mark. So if you ever see that question mark symbol, that's what that means. It means that it's an optional property. So what we can do now is we can say, okay, instead of naming this as default config, we're going to say that you are now a config. And look, my compiler seems to be working. And what's really great is whether that's empty or whether I pass an object that doesn't have anything, or whether I pass in a name. I could put items if I wanted, and my autofill actually recognizes this, which is cool. So I could put in different values, of course. Notice how this is different from this. But I can leave out things, and I can put things in any combination I'd like because of what we've done here. And now I have the behavior that I had originally wanted. And my function, of course, could now do something like, we can make our, I don't know, I'll call it constructed config, can now be the combination of our config as well as the default config.
So, can I ask you, so what you did on line 32, is that similar to creating a class and then just, making defaults for the class, and then what you do lower down is only assign the values of the parameters of that class that you care about, where the defaults are always already going to be assigned here in line 32.
So it's kind of there's no concept of a class in this case. This is an interface, which is just the template for an object.
Okay.
So it's not technically a class per se. And this technically isn't a class either. We're simply kind of performing some operations on this object template to kind of create a new template. In classes, you could do something like this, though, where you could essentially, now actually I haven't tried this, but if I had some class, let's call it animal, and it had some private property name, which is a string. And I could say, this dot name equals name. And if I had, let's call it, this will be kind of sad, orphaned animal that doesn't have a name or it's optional. Too dark, I don't know, it's 2020.
Yeah.
Now, I don't actually know if this will, if it allows you to override stuff in a class. So with class inheritance, we have a slightly different situation where here we're saying, okay, an orphaned animal extends a normal animal. It just has optional values, and it looks like this doesn't actually. Oh wait, sorry, I didn't call my super. So. Okay, so this is an example of actually TypeScript doesn't allow this. So this is actually new to me. I didn't realize this was a problem because I've never done this before. So notice it says the class orphan animal incorrectly extends base class animal. Types have separate declarations of a private property name. So essentially what we're doing is this guy is overriding this in a way that's unacceptable to TypeScript. And to me, this actually makes sense because this kind of defeats the purpose of using a base class to begin with. Like, why create a base class if you're gonna make some of those things optional, right? Because it kind of defeats the it's the idea of a base class is that that's the core, that everything that belongs to that category is or has. And by making them optional, it kind of defeats the purpose of using it as a base class. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so you could do like, some other property could be optional in orphan animal, but just not name.
Sure. Like, so name in this case would be, this would still have to be the case. And in fact, I don't even need to define name, but what I could
But
do
you made it
is
optional there. Does that work? There, how you just had it?
well, if I omit optional, then first of all, it's just redundant. We already know that it has a name because that's what we defined as the animal.
But what about what you have right here?
Say that again.
What about what you have right here, which is taking the constructor and making the name option?
Oh, so this would then essentially make this, the thing is this essentially kind of does it, but in a very implicit way. Like, this is not how I would want to do this.
I have a question, but
Yeah,
the question mark make it optional the value, not the property, right?
Correct. Like, the idea here is saying all animals have an optional property called name.
So when we're doing in line 42 name question mark and a string, it's the same like if we are doing name and then somebody can put null or undefined.
Exactly. This question mark is short for same. That's effectively the same thing. It's
Okay.
just this is shorthand.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah. So this example right here effectively does what we were talking about, but it's there's a lot of implicit behavior in this that I don't necessarily like. I'm not sure that I'd want to do my implementation this way.
Right.
Yeah,
no worries. I mean, I didn't want to distract from the TypeScript.
No,
it's
no, not at all. Not a distraction at all. It's a great question because it's really easy to confuse classes with interfaces because they are so they're related. They're very similar. And in fact, you can use classes to implement interfaces. I don't know if we'll get to that today, but like you can use an interface as a way of kind of defining a class, which is kind of cool. But anyway, so this is a case where using a type alias is actually a bit more intuitive than using class inheritance. But again, they're different things. Like they're just different ways of solving different problems. So, I'm not going to say that you should do one way or the other. It's just that these are concepts and these are the tools you have to work with. And so you want to use the tool that makes the most sense for the solution you're trying to create. This is just an example of kind of saying like, okay, like it gets the job done in effectively the same way that this does. But not really, because we still have this base class that still requires these properties. Whereas this, we are straight up saying that this type doesn't care if those properties exist or not. There's a subtle difference between the two things. So this would not be the way to go, in my opinion, for this particular example. But that is a fantastic question. So let's see here. So this is an example of kind of the power of type aliases. And my whole point of doing this example is to actually show you where these come from. These are all just type aliases that have just simply already been defined. So what we just did here is literally the same thing as doing, I'm gonna put it below it and comment this out and write it in a different way. Does that make sense?
That's a little easier.
Yeah, so you can kind of think of these built-in utility types as like, they're still types, but you kind of treat them like functions-ish, sort of. You don't want to think of them too much as functions because they're still just dealing with types, not actual values. They're not really processing things in the same way, but like we're kind of using type aliases to construct new types. And so like the definition of partial, so if you hover over this, you can actually see this is how it is in the actual, this is how it's supplied to you. So notice we're saying, hey, take some type. This is again just a generic type. We're saying whatever T is, I want you to grab all the keys of it. We're going to define each one as P. It's just like in a for loop when you say for, const key of object or something. We're grabbing each property, we're making it optional, and then we're setting it to whatever its respective value is. And that's what we did here. We just kind of hard coded it with this, but partial gives us that as just a more general use utility function or utility type, I mean. So hopefully you can kind of at least see where that's coming from now. There are other types as well. Record is really cool. I want to show you that next. But before I do that, does this make sense? Does anybody have any questions before I talk about records?
So to kind of summarize, the partial is what you use when you have sort of a default type that you want optional values on.
Sure. Yep. That's a very common use case for it. Basically, anytime you need to make some type have optional properties while still keeping the original shape, boom, it's perfect for that. And what's really cool about it is that you can use it to you can use it to construct a lot of really cool types. Like, for example, let's say version 2 comes along and you know what, I don't want to break my old version, but you know, we can then say, okay, type 2 default, type v2 default config comes along, and this is simply default config and my new properties. So, you know, version 2 properties, let's say it's a string. And then our config is now partial of this. Or I guess I don't even need that. So you can kind of see how these fit together as Legos.
So
Make
V2 just adds an additional option there.
Totally. Yep. So now if I go down here and I say, hey, I want to use my V2 property. Hey, look, now it shows up.
Cool. Yeah. It's so hard to like, or it's like kind of easy to understand these, but then you're kind of like, what's the real use case?
Right. Yeah. And like, that's where just like forcing yourself to do projects in TypeScript really forces you to understand when and where to do certain things. And, you know, it really, it just takes time. It took me several months of just tinkering and pulling my hair out to like really understand how it's like kind of the proper way to do this stuff.
So like, just like your standard understand JavaScript, like building a to-do app with TypeScript and
Right.
just like simple projects, you just sort of start there.
Yeah, my best recommendation is, especially if you've finished the course, assuming you're in B school, or maybe you're almost done, or you know, whatever, the best way to do TypeScript is to go back to the earliest projects and just rewrite them in TypeScript. You get the extra benefit of reviewing, you know, the basics, but with kind of a new challenge. It lets you do something that you've already done that was kind of old and stuff, and you get to look at it in a new way. That's my best recommendation for people going through an actual boot camp or have finished it.
Yeah. Do you find yourself using TypeScript on the job?
Say what?
Do you find yourself using TypeScript on the job, your current job?
Our entire stack is TypeScript.
Oh, okay.
Everything. In fact, I haven't used vanilla JavaScript in 2 years.
Oh.
I do
Good to know.
like I do only TypeScript. So for 2 different companies too. So yeah, it's pretty powerful. It's a really good thing to know. And I don't think a lot of boot camps teach it. To be honest with you, I don't know of a single boot camp that actually has TypeScript as like a core part of the curriculum. I don't blame them. Say what?
I said it seems to be like a gap. I mean, if you know, a lot of employers use it, that's kind of why I decided to jump onto this. I've been seeing a lot more and more TypeScript. And,
yeah, exactly. And it's honestly, it's brand new. I mean, like it didn't start taking off until very recently. So like just within the last couple of years that it's like really become more and more used. So, there's with the way with how fast technology is changing and stuff, even boot camps who are really agile, still, it's still hard to catch up. Because you got to write the curriculum and all that stuff. It's tough for sure. But the nice thing is that once you know JavaScript, then jumping into TypeScript, it's not really that big of a leap. The hardest part is the initial learning curve is just getting used to that extra compile time step, and just getting used to some of those configurations and stuff. Like that's a little tricky, but once you like nail that, then the actual syntax and stuff is actually not too bad.
I was about to say, maybe TypeScript is like one of those things that like you can learn on your own. Like,
yeah, I mean, I definitely believe that most of this stuff can be learned on your own. Like I learned TypeScript on my own. It was mostly out of necessity, but it's definitely possible. But yeah, I definitely think that I definitely see in the future.
If you know JavaScript, that's what I meant.
Oh, yeah, right. And what I'm trying to think of is how difficult it would be for someone to learn TypeScript if they've never coded before. That I don't really know if there would be a benefit to teaching TypeScript like out of the box to new programmers.
It feels like
I
you need to
haven't.
have the foundation, right? Like vanilla JavaScript.
Yeah. I mean, like there are some things that there are some things that I think would actually benefit new programmers. Like the fact that types are enforced, like really kind of, it does force you to pay more attention to what your program is doing. But but also the mental overload of that also could take a toll for new people. But then I think about, people who had to learn Java, they don't have a choice. It's typed. There's no.
I was about to say that, like, the difference for my cousin that he studied computer science is that he learns Java and boot camps learn JavaScript because Java takes more time because it's type, I guess. It's not loose. JavaScript is loose, so.
Yeah, JavaScript is very, very loose. So like, I don't know. Like, I think it'd be interesting to try to teach someone JavaScript, but doing TypeScript first. It might be cool. It might work. It might not. I'm not really sure. I haven't tried it. I don't really.
Learning one,
yeah, it really is. I mean, JavaScript was the first language I learned, and I liked it because it was, I think learning a loose language first, there's a lot of benefits to it. Because you can always, once you get like the hang of it, then adding more stuff onto it after isn't really that hard. Like going from JavaScript to Java is not that hard, relatively speaking. You already have the basic understanding and concepts in your head, and so it's not much of a leap. But having to start out with all that could be hard.
I learned Java first, and then JavaScript was like, oh my god, what are you doing my way? So much more loose.
Yeah, I mean, was it easy to learn Java first? I mean,
I did my CS degree in 2000. I started in 2005, right? Okay. And then I finished in 2008. So, I mean, that was really what the curriculums were back then, was Java, C, right. C++. But then when I got kind of in the advanced, like the last couple of courses in my undergrad, we learned web development. It was all pretty new back then. And,
right.
And JavaScript was just like, oh my god, it's so much better. Now it's even way better. I stopped coding for like 10 years. I wind back here, but I'm really impressed with all all the advancements, ES6 and all that.
Yeah, it's pretty nuts how much it's advanced just in like the last even just 5 years.
Mm.
Like even when I started, like I didn't start coding until like 4 years ago, and like ES6 hadn't come out yet. And now it's everywhere. It's ubiquitous. So it's kind of crazy how fast this stuff moves.
Just to go a little bit to the tangent, do you guys use Redux?
At work, or are you asking me?
Yes, at work.
So sort of. The short answer to your question is no. The slightly longer answer to your question is yes, but poorly. Because
Okay.
whoever implemented Redux into our app, which originally was built using AngularJS, and it's terrible. I don't think the person actually understood Redux, and so like the way that they implemented it is just a nightmare. So I try not to use it because they did not do it right.
So you work for a company that have a lot of code base for
Yeah.
sure. So
Yeah.
it's possible to have a big code base without Redux implementation.
Oh yeah, of course. Yeah. And in fact, like with like Angular, it's not even really necessary to use Redux. Like honestly, Redux is a little bit redundant in a lot of ways. Like at least like Angular 7 is it's really they use what are called observables, and which in my opinion are way better than Redux. Redux is cool. I don't have anything against Redux, but there seem to be other systems that work just as good or not, if not better.
Okay, that's curious.
Yeah, and like in React, Redux is essentially baked into it now with context. Like there's not even a need to use Redux because it's already practically in there, like implicitly in like the use context hook. I don't know if you've used that before, but
Yeah, I was reading about use context and use.
yeah,
There's one more.
yeah, and there's like some hook. There's a hook called a use reducer. So like basically you can just do Redux using context and use reducer. It follows the same pattern.
Okay.
Yeah. But anyway, what's cool is that TypeScript makes that way easy. It makes Redux like really, really fun to use. Because it's a lot easier to like, I don't know, it's just with TypeScript can make managing big states like very simple, which is nice. And I think in the last episode of TypeScript for Code Talk, I'm planning on doing like a little React thing. So maybe if I have time, I'll try to include like a little Redux example.
One thought I had, Ben, was
Yeah.
if you're thinking of other, sure there's probably a long list, but how do you kind of dig into big code bases, especially if you think about like as call it a new developer, getting up to speed with a big application, like what's what do you, it's a good approach, or do you have any tips or thoughts?
Yeah, definitely. So like I had never done Angular before. So when I first did my boot camp, which was in 2017, we were still doing AngularJS. So I learned AngularJS, but then React came out, or at least it started becoming more well known, like pretty much right at the end of my boot camp. So like AngularJS was kind of already on its way out. And when I got hired at Fidelity, which is beginning of last year, they were doing Angular 7. So I've been doing React for the last 3 years, never done Angular in my life. And so I get hired to do Angular. and it's this gigantic application. It's insane. There's like 1,000 files. It's insane. So the first thing I did is I would just play around with like, I would just make little Angular apps. Go like like their documentation has great tutorials. Pretty much all the main frameworks have like really great tutorials. So like, the React one has a good one, Vue has a good one, Angular has a good one. So I did that. So that way I could just kind of get a handle on like the building blocks of it. And then the next thing is I asked to be given like features or things to do in the app that weren't like crazy hard or anything. So like, if you've got a good hiring manager, the best thing you can do is ask them to give you like a simple feature to add or a simple bug fix to solve, which will then force you to kind of look at the app in terms of like an actual problem that you're trying to solve. And then you can just like, at that point, it's really just a matter of like chasing down like the Skittle trail, like being like, okay, well, once you find that component on the screen that matches what's in VS Code or whatever, then you can kind of start piecing it all together in your mind. So like, I think one of the first things I had to do was like a button was like not appearing when it was supposed to be. So it was like really dumb, but it was a good start because it forced me to kind of see how things were put together. So yeah, start with small things. And then the more you engage with it, you're just going to start becoming more familiar with how everything's put together.
So that was like your first week was like
a
few days.
First month.
So they were pretty patient. It wasn't like, hey.
Oh yeah, no, they did not expect me, even though like I don't know, I'm technically like a mid-level developer, I guess. Like, I told them up front, I was like, yeah, I'm new to Angular, so I'm not gonna just be able to jump right in. So like, oh, that's fine. Yeah, like they didn't expect me to do anything productive for like at least a month, which was nice.
Cool.
So yeah, does that help? Does that give you some?
Yeah.
Cool.
Do you guys work on like just one repo, one huge repo, or it's like one repo for the front end, one repo from the back end?
There's tons of repositories for like, we have our team alone only works in one repository. We just started a new project, which is 3 new repositories. It's insane. Like the API team, like there's an entire team dedicated just to the API that we use, which is its own separate repository. Like we don't even, if there's a problem, we have to go talk to them.
So it's like microservices for.
They're not really microservices. It's just like they built the server that we use to get the data. So there's like the server team, the API team, and then there's like the database team. They're all separate.
Interesting.
But yeah, they're not really microservices because it's like one big API. It's not like we're like making calls to like different things like Amazon Web Services over here and like some other service over here. Like it's all just one architecture. Yeah, it's insane. I still don't really know how it's all put together. It's kind of mind-blowing when you see.
Really? Interesting.
Yeah, like just looking at the code base for Fidelity is just insane. Like I've only been there like 9 months.
Oh, okay.
And I feel like I still know hardly anything. Like I'm a lot more comfortable in like my little corner, but like as far as the wider context, it's kind of insane.
Probably took years to build with hundreds of developers, right?
Oh yeah. Like some of these APIs are like 20 years old. They're running on Oracle servers, or they're running in they're running these Oracle databases, which are living on these Linux servers, which are old as hell.
Mhm.
And we have to talk to them with our Angular app, and it's just insane.
And you do Angular, you don't do React.
Yes, unfortunately. I mean, I like Angular. The new Angular is cool. I just hate AngularJS.
That's the one that you do?
Yeah, I wish that we were doing React though. React is way better.
I was asking because I was checking this video from YouTube video from last year that they say that some companies now do cross-functional teams, which is like you are not like a front-end developer or back-end developer or database developer. I don't know. What you do is like you focus just on one part. Like let's say you focus on the payments part of the app, but your team is focusing on everything. It's like instead of being like horizontal teams, you have verticals because now you can do micro front end, microservices, and DevOps at the same time. So like your team is doing React, Express, I don't know, Postgres, and doing the payment part, and the other team is doing the car part of the web application, but they're doing Vue and something else and another database, MongoDB. So
yeah, I don't know how they put that together.
I was reading that Amazon do that, but just the companies that are technology, they are on the edge of technology. They're doing that because it's something like new way to do things.
Yeah, and just like with anything else, there's pros and cons. Like the con that I see with doing it that way is that there's always a bottleneck somewhere. So the bottleneck in that case would be like, okay, so you've got these individual isolated silos that work really great on their own. But then how do you get them to talk to each other? How do you get them like to live in the same like spot? You know what I mean?
Yeah,
that's just the challenge of doing it that way.
Yeah, they do. The way they do it is they use the build tools like the Webpack, something that's called Federation, module Federation, and with that, it seems like on build time everything just works like magic.
Yeah. So like someone would, I imagine some DevOps people would be like in charge of kind of taking all those silos and somehow combining.
But again, I'm not by any means like I understood everything that I saw in the video, but it doesn't seem bad at all. It seems very easy because your team, like if your team is 5 people doing that part, all of you guys to know front end, back end, and DevOps. Like everybody knows all the 3 knowledge, and all the 5 people are working at the same time on that because this Webpack Federation is like very straightforward for what in the way the person explained. So, but it's something new. It's something new. It's no.
I'll have to look into it. Sounds cool. There's there's I don't really know anything about that either, so I can't really like comment on it, but it sounds like an interesting idea. And our organization, there's like aspects of it, like within our team, like we've got testers and DevOps and things like that. Everyone kind of has like a little bit of expertise in all these areas. So combined, we kind of know everything, or the full stack or whatever. But that sounds cool. Let's see here. Anyways, do you want to learn more TypeScript?
Sure.
Bit of a digression, but yeah.
That's all good.
Sorry, it's like we know that you have a lot of knowledge, so we are like asking questions.
No, that's what this is for. That's why I do this. So don't worry about going on tangents. I like rabbit holes. They can be fun. Okay, so what was I talking about? Oh yeah, type aliases. Okay, so now we've talked about partial, which is basically a way of just making all the properties of an object optional. which really just means that they can be undefined or some other value. Okay, well, there's something what's called a record, which is very cool. So a record is really just kind of a fancy way of saying that it's a way of describing an object, but where each key value pair is the same type. Okay, so like for example, let's say I have a dictionary. So I'm going to define an interface and I'm going to call it dictionary. Okay, a dictionary is just a object that has a word. So we'll call it W for word, which is a string. And it's a string, right? So if I want to create a dictionary, then whatever values I put here, so we'll put the word and to the letter A, and and we can put the definition of the word and. I actually don't know what the definition of the word and is. Let's do apple, because that's easier. I've never actually tried to define the word and. That would be a really hard thing to do, because you wouldn't be able to use the word and in the definition. Wow, anyways. Okay, apple, a delicious fruit. Right, and then you know, you've got bread, a delicious yeast concoction. I don't know how to define bread. Okay, and then you could see how this would go on forever, right? It's a dictionary in this case is just an object that has keys that are strings and values that also are strings. Make sense?
Yeah.
Cool. That is what is called a computed property, right? On line 53.
Yeah. Yep.
Okay.
Yep. And then, well, technically it's not a computed property, it's just a dynamic property.
Okay.
So, okay, let's see. Okay, cool. So that's a dictionary. This is, there are some limitations of doing things this way because, you know, suppose that I don't know whether that's a string or not. You know, suppose it's, you know, suppose it's a number or a string, or suppose it's a, I don't know, maybe this is a library of configs. Who knows? Like, what if I don't know what that is? Like, what if I don't know what this is? Then we can, again, exploit generics. Okay, so we can now say, okay, so we'll assume that the type will be provided when we use this. Okay, so we'll just say, okay, well, our dictionary is, we're just going to give it some object. Okay, and then our dictionary is simply key value pairs where the key is just a string and the value is whatever this type is. In fact, I should call this T, not O. The idea is we're saying, make a dictionary that has key value pairs where each key points to whatever that is. So my dictionary now, I could say string, and this would now work. Okay, well, suppose I said, no, I want you to be a dictionary of numbers. Okay, well, now I've got a problem because apple is no longer a string. It has to be, you know, let's rename these to X and Y. Now it works just fine. Right? Let's get rid of that yellow line. Okay. Make sense?
Yep.
So now, since this is such a common thing, this idea is already packed in with TypeScript, and it's simply just called a record. Okay, so instead of calling it a dictionary, we can comment that out, and this is actually just a record. And then what we have to do is we have to say, it actually takes 2 arguments. So the first thing is what type of key it is, because remember, a key can be a number or a string. Like there's nothing stopping me from doing something like this, or 0 index, 1 index, etc. Okay, so I could say if this record could be a number that points to strings. Okay, so this is fine. I could also say you are a record of numbers, which then I would have to say 0 and then 1, 1, 2, 2, whatever they may be. What's cool though is that, okay, this is fine, but I can use any type I want. So suppose I want to use our config from earlier. Let's say I want to use this guy. Well, now all of a sudden, my dictionary looks a lot more interesting. Now each property is an object that has those properties. So perhaps I'm making a whole bunch of configurations for some reason. Can't think of a use case for this at the moment. But like we've now got this type that is a much more interesting type. It's a record that's indexed by number and points to config types as their values. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yep.
Cool. And you could imagine that maybe this is, I could give it IDs, which is a number. So now all of a sudden this has to be an ID. And that has to be a number. This has to be ID. And this has to be a number. And this has to be a number, etc.
This makes all this information about data types makes you in a way also a better when one needs to design a database. I believe it gives you more perspective on that. I don't know, it seems like, because you're always like thinking about the data type and the data that you're going to use. I believe it's help you when you have to design your database, the tables.
Yeah, I agree for sure. Yeah, because especially because things like interfaces and stuff are like natural analogies to database schemas and templates. So like, yeah, when I'm designing a database, I define my schema basically with an interface.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's totally right.
So if you wanted, instead of numbers for the first part of your key, you could make that a string and.
Totally.
Okay.
Yep.
That just defines the first part.
Yep. So then you'd be like, test 1, test 2. So there you go. Now there's some limitations on record. For one, you can't just use anything. Like I can't use a Boolean to index a record. That doesn't make sense. The only things you can use are strings, numbers, or symbols. That's it. If you're not sure what a symbol is, I won't go into that today, but it's a data type that is not used very often, but it's a way of uniquely identifying properties on an object. But yeah, so those are your only options: string, number, or symbol for your key type on a record. These then, so if we look back at these utility types, so we looked at partial and we looked at record. So hopefully you can kind of get an idea of what the rest are. Read only or pick, I think, is pretty self-explanatory. This means create a type that only contains, or it's grab me a type from X, in this case, whatever type I give it, and only pick those properties from it. Omit is the opposite. Omit means give me everything that doesn't belong in that set of keys.
Those seems very useful.
They're very useful. Yeah, definitely. Extract and exclude are a little more subtle. They have to do with unions, but they're also very useful. I've never actually used read only. I've never had a situation where I needed it, but it seems useful. Return type's cool. It just gives you the return type of a function type that you pass into it. Yeah. I haven't really used, I've only used maybe half of these in my day. But they're there, they exist, they're pretty rad. But what's really, really cool is when you put it all together along with generics. I mean, this is using generics, but you can get some very amazing types when you put this all together. So I think we got a little bit of time left. So let me show you. I don't expect anyone to fully understand how this function works off the bat, but at least it'll we'll be able to kind of pick out the things that are important. So the reason why I was playing around with this is because I heard on the Slack channel that there was a challenge out there to come up with a function that can tell you whether or not a given series of characters is valid. And the validity of those characters is based on opening and closing brackets. So, for example, that would be valid, that would be valid, that would be valid. Because again, every brace has a respective closing brace and it's in the right scope. Okay, so like this is valid because this one closes off this first one, and then this one closes off that one. This one's valid because the outer curly braces close off just fine. Inside they close off just fine. Whereas over here, none of these are valid because in this case, you can't have a closing brace if there wasn't an opening one, and vice versa. This one, you have the incorrect closing brace. Same with this one, you have an incorrect closing brace trying to close this one. And then same with this one, you have a closing brace before the opening brace. So does that make sense what the function's designed to do?
Yeah, it's cool to see the tests written for it.
Yeah, this one would be really hard to do without writing tests because I wouldn't be very, very confident in it. You know what I mean? There's so many combinations.
Did you try by any chance using the ASCII code?
No, because what I did is I made it so that you could customize whatever your characters are.
Okay.
I separated out the logic for what the characters are and how they relate to each other. So basically, you use, hey, look, wait, where is it? Where did I put it? Oh, yeah, look at this. I used that config pattern I was talking about. Not exactly the same way, but the way it works is you pass in a configuration, which looks like this. It's just a record of bracket rules. And if you look at these bracket rules, well, okay, let me start over. This is a factory. Does anyone not know what a factory is?
as in like where they would make cars?
A factory function.
A function that creates functions?
Yeah, it's a function that creates a function.
Okay, that's a new term for me. Yeah.
Yeah, that is typically what a factory, and another word for a factory is if a factory is a more specific example of a closure. So in JavaScript, a closure is any time that you have a inner function that is using variables outside its scope, or that were defined outside of its scope. A factory just exploits that concept. So the idea here is to say, okay, I want to create, and I'll show you how this is being used, and then I'll show you kind of how the TypeScript is put together. So, okay, here's my tests for my parse brackets function. Okay, so I've decided ahead of time that there are two factories that I kind of can imagine building. One is an empty one, which would probably be useless, but whatever. But then I had one that's more of a typical example. So the idea is, okay, I want to be able to define what my characters are and how they relate to each other. So then that way, if I decided to use parentheses or brackets or any letter whatsoever, I can define it in my configuration. So this just says my open curly brace pairs with my closing curly brace. And we're saying, okay, this guy is open, which means it's a opening bracket, and it's paired with this guy, which of course is defined over here. That is not an opening brace. We don't need to pair it because it's already been paired up here. So that's what these are. If I wanted to add more, I could. So if I wanted to add this, I could say, hey, open, true, pair with, I don't know, that. It's arbitrary, however you want to do it. I could even do, I actually didn't even put parentheses in this example. So here you go. So there's that. And then you've got your closing parenthesis, which of course is false. Okay. The idea here is to be able to configure my function so that when I actually use this function, I can use the characters that I've defined here in these ways. It just allows me some customization. It might be unnecessary because the ASCII key way could be just as well, to be honest with you. But regardless, that's what I decided to do.
So so that's an object where the key is the opening parentheses, and then the property or the value is that inner object.
Yep. Okay. And these aren't all, the keys here are the opening and the closing. So like here's the open and here's the close.
Oh, here's the close.
It's just that they're configured. One says it's just defined based on what type of bracket they are. This says you are an open bracket and you're paired with this closing bracket. This bracket is a closing bracket.
Yep. Got it. Okay.
Yeah.
I want to make sure I got that.
Yeah. So let's look at how this function is kind of defined. We know that it is so this function, parse bracket factory, right here, takes a configuration object as an argument. This configuration object, there's that type alias keyword. We're saying, hey, you are a object or a record that has it's indexed by string, which you can see here. Wait, where'd it go? You can see here, they're indexed by strings. No, nothing crazy going on there. And this is returning, is a record of strings with values that are bracket rules. Okay, the bracket rules are simply the types for either that object or this object. There's only two options. Either it's this object where open is false, or it's this object where open is true and pair is a string. Those are my two options. So if we look at that definition, we're saying bracket rules is either opening bracket rules or closing bracket rules. Open obviously has this property as true. This property is false. And there is no pair because you don't need it for the closing bracket rules. So that's what we get. We're left with this record that is an object of strings pointing to bracket rules. Make sense so far?
Yeah. It's cool to see it in the wild.
Yeah. So now the parse bracket factory is a function, of course, that takes that object. But the key here is that it then returns a function that takes a string as an argument and then tells you whether it's valid or not. Okay, so this is the return value of that function. Actually, technically, this is the return value, this whole thing. Okay, so when we call this function the parse bracket factory, what we're getting is a new function that has access to the scope of that config variable. So let's look at what this is doing. Now this function right here, the return function, we're actually defining we're defining its shape right here. We're saying, hey, you're a string that returns either a Boolean or a never. Okay, never is what you use when I'll explain that in a second. Usually you do that if like there's some reason for the function to never actually return. So like, for example, if you throw an error, and that's what I'm using in this case, is there's the possibility that if you pass in a character that's not legit, it'll error out. So I just did some character checking to make sure that they're legit. Okay. So let's see what I'm doing here. So obviously string is a string and it's returning a Boolean. It's just simply saying, hey, is this bracket configuration valid? Are there opening and closing brackets in the right spot? So now the logic here is pretty straightforward. Although this is a tricky problem because there's so many combinations to think of that like this is a hard problem. This is definitely a tricky problem. But the idea is actually pretty simple once you think about it. Because what you can do is you can loop through the string one at a time. Okay, one character at a time. And you can ask a couple of questions on each iteration. You can ask yourself, hey, is that an opening brace? If it is, then that means that we simply can keep going. Because what we care about is whether or not this closes at some point. So what we're going to do is we just use a queue. A queue is just an array that it's a first in, last out kind of thing. Right? First in.
Yeah.
Yeah. First in, first out, or first in, last out. So essentially what we're doing is we're saying, okay, if I see an opening brace, then I'm simply going to put that into the queue. If I see a closing brace, then that means there's only a couple options. Either it's paired with the last thing in the queue, or it isn't. So if it's not paired with the last item in the queue, or maybe even the queue's empty, then it's invalid. Just, you can throw out the whole thing, because there's never going to be a situation where you arrive at a closing brace and the last item in the queue isn't its respective closing brace and have it still be valid. It's just, by definition of the problem, that can't happen. That's not, like, by definition of what counts as a valid bracket placement, that can never happen. So essentially, if the last item in the queue doesn't pair with the closing brace you've just encountered, then throw it out. It's over. If it does pair, then great. We'll just pop out that last item. So then what's left? Well, whatever the previous opening brace was. And now we can move on with our life. And hey, look at that. If we happen to encounter another closing bracket, then again, we just make the comparison. So all we're doing at any given character is just comparing the current character with whatever is in the queue up to that point. And if it matches, we pop it out and we continue on. If it doesn't, you break and it's invalid and we move on with our life. Make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. So that's the logic. So as far as TypeScript is concerned, let's just look at a few things that I'm doing here. So my queue, so the first thing is I have to define what my queue is, which is really just an array, but it's an array of only keys of my configuration. I can't put in characters that don't belong to that config. So my TypeScript is actually going to be, I'm being pretty particular here. Like this isn't just an array of strings. This is actually an array of the keys, which as you can see, the keys are defined here. So it's not just strings, it's a more particular set of strings. It's whatever I put in this configuration file, or the object, I mean. So that's what my queue is. Okay, and then I just loop through the string. Grab our current character, grab the last item in the queue, and then we just do those checks that I talked about. I won't spend too much time on the logic here, but basically, okay, if there's a problem, so if that doesn't match, if there isn't a property of that character, that means that I put in a bad character. So I'm just going to throw an error, and that's where that never comes in. If you throw an error in a function, then it can never return anything, obviously. Okay, so then it does a few things, and just what you'll notice is that there's really, doesn't seem to be any TypeScripty stuff, and throughout most of this, it's only up here.
Right.
And that's because everything is able to be inferred.
Because you set it up with those types.
Yes.
You can feel confident that everything that runs within there should be what it needs to be.
Exactly. And in fact, I'm going to tweak a few things and I'm going to show you how TypeScript breaks when we do this. So let's say that I do this wrong and I say, I'm gonna comment this out. Wait, no, that's the wrong one. I want to comment this one out. No. Oh, it's this one. This is the one. So I'm going to comment this out. And let's look at what just happened. Look at what the parser says. So just to provide some context, we've already checked to make sure that the character is valid. We've already checked to see if it's an open bracket. So at this point in the code, we know that we've arrived at a character that is a closing bracket. Okay, so now if the queue is empty and we hit a closing bracket, that's invalid. So we've already passed that point. So now we can assume at this point that we have hit a character that is a closing bracket, and we simply need to compare it with the last item of the queue to see if it matches. That's what we're doing here. Okay, so we're saying if current scoped open bracket dot pair isn't equal to the character, meaning that the pair that's defined by that opening bracket that's at the last item of the queue, if they don't match, then I know that it's invalid. But our compiler is yelling at me. It's saying that property pair does not exist on type bracket rules. Well, that's interesting because if we look at our bracket rules, I've said, hey, you're one of those. But okay, if we look at what those are, one of these has a pair and one of them doesn't. Right? If it's an open bracket, then it has this pair property. If it's a closing bracket, it doesn't. So that means that TypeScript is actually doing its job. It's saying, hey, you didn't specify which bracket rule you're using. So I'm not gonna just let you do that. I don't know if it has a pair. Only one of them does. You've gotta tell me which one it is before I'm gonna let you pass. So that's why this line is so crucial. Because it's only in the case that open is true that that pair property exists.
Cool.
Yeah, very subtle. And that's not something, it's very likely that if you're writing this in normal JavaScript, this line would probably not be written. And you might get away with it. It might be okay. But it won't pass the TypeScript compiler. So yeah, that's an example of TypeScript in action using type aliases.
That's cool. Now your code's like rock solid.
It's pretty solid. Not to boast, but yeah, it's pretty solid.
That's
Cool.
That's cool. It's cool to see that you don't have to do it within within your for loop and add all the types there, for example.
Right. I mean, I could, like, there's nothing stopping me from being like, hey, you're a string or you're a key of type of config. Like, but if you set things up properly in the beginning, usually this stuff can just be inferred. See how that's a string. We know that that's a number. We know that this guy right here, like for example, notice how it autofilled because it knows that config C, because I have to find it as not just, I defined my queue as not just an array of arbitrary strings, but I've defined it as an actual key of my configuration. That means that if I ever access a key on that thing, then I know that it's going to have this open property. I just know it. And my autocomplete will also recognize it as such. So there's a lot of like subtleties here, but that's kind of some of the really powerful stuff with TypeScript. And when you've got a gigantic project with thousands of lines of code, having that autocomplete to help you out is pretty helpful.
Awesome.
Yeah.
I have to jet here, Ben, but really appreciate it once again.
Yeah, no problem. Have a good day.
You too. Next week we are, what's next week?
Next week is, I forget if I'm doing React, the React TypeScript, or if there's one more thing. This is only episode, is this the fourth one already?
Third.
Oh, today's only the third one?
Third,
I believe
yeah.
so.
I think I may have.
3 of 6. Yeah.
6 may have been too many, but that's right. Let me look at the B-School blog to double check.
This next one's advanced types.
Oh, okay. So I think I've gotten a little ahead of schedule. Yeah, today was type aliases, interfaces, and enums. I kind of did some of that last week. We did aliases today. So yeah, we'll talk about advanced types next week. Actually, that's good because there's a few things here that I didn't actually really explain. For example, this key of and this type of, that's going to be next week. So you got a little bit of a taste of it today. But we'll be looking a little bit more into that.
So our homework is to build one thing in Typescript before next week.
Yes. So that will be very helpful, and it can be really simple. It doesn't really matter what it is, even if it's just like a little edit problem. Like
Yeah, cool.
The hardest part, well, it's not really hard, but like, set up your TypeScript config file, get your development environment running.
Yeah, which we have
this-
that repo that you shared.
Yeah, and I'm using this repo right now for that. So
Sweet.
yeah. And if you have any questions, hit me up.
All right, guys. Have a good one.
Cool. All righty.
See you then.
Bye.
Well, I appreciate it.
Yep. No problem. Well, I guess we'll see you guys next week.
Thank you, Ben, for the last time, for your help. It was I appreciate it a lot.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, I can't believe that problem was just from URLs not matching or environment variables not matching.
I'm sorry, I've never done that before, so I had no idea.
Yeah, I didn't even think to check. I mean, in hindsight, it's just like, oh, duh, but.
But it's just the example, the environment sample. I don't know if you remember the file that they put it there. They did it in the React. They didn't put the auth, and in the backend they put the auth part. And then I'm like, okay, I assume there is a reason they did that. So I follow that, and then both needs to be the same. So I'm like, that makes no sense because the sample was a bad. Anyhow, I don't know. I didn't think about that. But it was hard because not putting that makes things work halfway. So it would be nice.
You just cut out. What was that?
Oh no, I said it would be nice that it doesn't work at all, but not putting that there, it makes it work halfway, even more than halfway. So it was like, it didn't go. Anyhow.
Yeah, that's annoying when that happens.
That's cool. Do you have any, I don't know, any tutorial that you recommend or resource for? I want to build this project that I told you, but I am very confused about how to design the tables. Do you have something? I don't know. Is that
when you say design the tables, you mean database, like SQL tables?
Yeah. So I have the even I use Figma to put the interfaces or the UIs. I should call it UIs. But I don't have a very good grasp of how to create. I mean, I know how to create the tables, but I don't know how to design the relationships between the tables. Like what is the model? I guess the models.
And this is for so are you connecting a Node Express app to a SQL database?
Yeah, I'm planning to use React. React, Express, and Postgres.
Okay, so I have never actually used SQL with Node. I've always used MongoDB.
Okay.
So I'm not really sure.
I can use MongoDB, I guess.
But
sure.
I mean, like MongoDB is like, if you decide to use Mongoose, I can definitely give you more information.
Okay.
But I mean, like we can also like if you're just trying to think of just like the conceptual relationships, we can definitely talk about that regardless of what you use. But as far as like specific implementations, I'm not really sure because I haven't used SQL in Node. You'll probably just have to go to the SQL documentation. I'm sure there's lots of examples there.
I mean, honestly, I do want to practice database, but it can be Mongo because at the end of the day, I want to practice both. So I could use Mongo without a problem, but in Mongo, I still need to create, maybe they're not called tables. I believe they're called documents.
Yeah, they're called collections.
Collections?
Yeah, well, the collections are like the equivalent of a table, and then documents are the equivalent of a record.
Okay, so record is the information, right?
Yeah, record is like the single thing. So like user or to do or something. And then the collection is like the the table of those things. So the user's collection versus the user table.
Gotcha. So
that's roughly
like I guess I am stuck in the part that I'm not sure, like I have to create collections, but these collections, I know they have to be related.
Right.
I don't know what is the one first to go and read more about it, but I don't know if you have.
They're called references. So like in SQL, you have one table that can like reference another. So like, for example, usually if you have, let's say you have like a social media site, you've got your users and then you've got posts, which are the things that people, post their pictures and whatnot. So the user itself is not going to have a property of all their posts that they've ever done. That is too much to put on the user. So what I would read about, if you're not familiar with it, is this idea of they're called relationships in databases, where there's several different types. There are one-to-one relationships, which defines how objects in a collection relate to each other. So for example, let's say I have a user, like a user auth model, which is simply their username and hashed password, let's say, like an account. And then you've got user preferences or user settings. So those would be kind of like the configured sets, the configured preferences of that person. So like, let's say they like dark mode, they want to, they have like their street address, their profile information and stuff. That would all be in like their user settings. That would be a one-to-one relationship, because there can only be one set of profile settings to one user, right? You can never have multiple users to one profile settings or vice versa. They're always just one-to-one. So that's called a one-to-one relationship. But there's two others. So there's one-to-many, and then there's a many-to-many relationship. And those are dealt with in different ways in the database. So in a one-to-many, what that means is that a single item in one collection can relate to multiple items in another collection. So a good example would be the posts that we talked about, where a single user or a single profile, whichever one you want to use, you could have lots of posts that came from that one user. So what you would do is in each one of those posts, you would have a user property or a creator property, whatever you want to call it, that then points to the ID of the user that posted. So that's called a one-to-many relationship, and it can go in either direction. Comments, So for example, now comments are okay. Let me think of a many-to-many example. This one's a little harder to think of. That's when you can have multiple items pointing to multiple items and vice versa. Whereas instead of having, a collection of posts that can refer back to one user, you can have, here's an example. So think of college classes, college courses. So you could have a collection of courses that each course has lots of students in it. You could have 30, let's say it's an upper grad class, so there's 20 people in it. Well, any given student could also be taking multiple courses.
Makes sense.
Right? So those are some of the basic relationships that tables and collections might have with each other. But yeah,
I'm gonna read more about it and do my tables. If you're available, I will send to you or let you know so you can check it out to give me your feedback. because I feel like if I do that wrong, everything is gonna go wrong.
Yeah, you have to be careful when you're designing that stuff because it can make things really hard later on.
Yeah. So I want to get some feedback because I start putting too much code. So I'm gonna this week have a busy week, but I'm gonna try to do that.
All right, sounds good.
Thank you, Ben, for having time.
Yeah, no problem. Have a good
See ya.
day.
You too.
See ya.